Welcome everybody as you're getting connected. You made it to the right place. You are in the River Talk. Welcome, folks. We are just hanging out for a couple minutes while everybody gets connected and we get people coming in. Good to see y'all. Welcome everybody. You made it to the right place. We're happy to see you. Glad you're here. We should mention too, Ryan, that they can, if they have any technical issues, maybe in the chat you can throw it in that you're the person to find if something happens.
Yep, sure can.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll give it a few more minutes here while people get connected. Okay, I'm going to open us out here and get started. People can trickle in as we start. So thanks everybody for coming and joining the River Talks today. I'm Hannah and I am staff at the Lake Superior Reserve. And the River Talks, in case you haven't been to one yet, the River Talks is a series of informal talks about the St. Louis River. So we hold these monthly. They're hosted by both the Lake Superior Reserve and Wisconsin Sea Grant program. And so these are designated to encourage conversation. So as our speakers get going, they're gonna share some slides with us and they have a presentation for us, but we don't want you to feel like you have to wait till the end for questions. If a topic comes up and you're like, oh, that didn't quite make sense, or I'd love to hear more about that, feel free to engage throughout the program today. So how you can do that is if you go to the very bottom of your Zoom window, there's a smiley face that says reactions. And if you click on that, then there's a raise hand button and that virtually raises your hand and I will look for you and I can relay a question to the speaker. So then you can just come off mute and ask your question. You also can use the chat button also down there at the bottom of your screen and you can just type a question in there and I will see that too and relay it to our presenters. So feel free to ask questions as we go, but we'll also have time at the end for sort of back and forth Q&A and discussion too. So whatever you feel like doing during the presentation or after. So we're really excited because we have two speakers tonight to talk about black ash and birds and conserving critical habitat in the estuary. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Alexis Grinde, who is sharing her screen now, who is a wildlife ecologist at University of Minnesota Duluth's Natural Resources Research Institute, and then also Cole Wilson, who is a undergraduate student at University of Wisconsin-Madison, about to graduate this spring. And he was also the freshwater fellow at the Lake Superior Reserve this summer. So without further ado, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. Thanks everybody for joining us. I am excited always to talk about black ash and birds. And so I'm excited to be here and also be part of Cole's presentation. Like Hannah said, my name is Alexis Grinde and I am an avian ecologist and I run the Avian Ecology Lab at the Natural Resources Research Institute. And generally our lab does a lot of different research projects, but we use birds as ecosystem indicators to sort of get an idea of how ecosystems are changing, habitats changing, and then do a lot of basic ecology on research on species of greatest conservation need as well. So I'm going to start the talk and give some overview of emerald ash borer and black ash in the state, and then I'll pass the virtual baton over to Cole and he'll talk about his research that's specific to the St. Louis River Estuary. All right, so for very broad context, at a global scale, we are in the midst of massive losses of biodiversity, and this is happening across continents, across habitat types, and it's a really big deal, and it's for a lot of different reasons, including climate change, habitat loss, habitat degradation, fragmentation, all of these sort of multiple factors are coming together, and we're seeing increased species that are threatened, increased extinction rates across many, many taxa. This is a real issue because even if we're not losing, like species aren't going extinct, they are decreasing in abundance. And as we lose diversity from different ecosystems where it has naturally been, that ecosystem starts functioning differently. And we know as a general ecological principle that if we maintain species diversity, we can maintain and promote ecosystem functioning as well. And that will help our ecosystems be more resilient to things like climate change, to things like invasive species. So sort of the goal of a lot of our research and just ecology in general is in the face of this massive change, what can we do at a local, a landscape, at a global scale to conserve species diversity? Well, we do know that habitat loss is the major threat to biodiversity, and this has been true for decades, and it continues to be true. And we can think about habitat loss in sort of two broad ways. One is, paving over a forest and setting up a neighborhood, that's loss and probably not coming back, right? But also habitat degradation, that's a really big issue too. And that can happen through increased pollutants, increased fragmentation, again, invasive species, a lot of different things go into habitat degradation. But as habitats sort of become less high quality, species will stop using them. And so then we'll see a decrease in species abundance in general. And we've definitely have a lot of data to say that particularly for birds that are monitored more than most taxa, we've seen significant declines in bird species across all habitat types since the 1960s in North America. So of course, United States and Canada. And that again is really consistent no matter what kind of habitats they really rely on. We're seeing broad population declines. And that's from a very important paper that came out in 2019 by Rosenberg et al. Now, why do we care about birds? Because they're awesome, one. And then also because Minnesota is a breeding bird hotspot. So it's one of the most diverse breeding bird communities in all of North America. And it's because we have awesome habitat. We have a lot of different forest types, plus we have these water components of the streams and the rivers and the wetlands that we'll be talking about today. And it supports a wide variety of birds. And a lot of those birds will migrate from the southern United States, but the majority of them actually come from Central and South America. And they migrate up here just to breed in, May, June, and July. Which is very soon, believe it or not, due to the snow. But they come up here because we have these habitat characteristics. They need trees, tree cavities, insects, right? And that's really what they need. They breed, they have babies, and then they migrate back down. And if we can do something here in Minnesota to increase the amount of bird babies that are sort of surviving and being made up here, that's awesome. But we have to think about habitat and those resources that the habitat provides in order to increase these populations. So just transitioning a little bit to the topic of the day, our emerald ash borer. So I'm sure most of you know about emerald ash borer, but emerald ash borer is a wood boring beetle that's native to Asia. So it's an invasive species here in North America. It likely came over to North America on like shipping containers or ships or something. But it was first identified in Michigan in 2002. And because this is an invasive species, all of our ash trees in North America, they have no defense against this emerald ash borer. An emerald ash borer gets into a tree species here in North America, and basically it's 100% mortality, more or less. And it can attack any native ash tree that's greater than an inch in diameter, which is a pretty small tree. So we could say essentially all trees, give or take, right? And that tree will die within 2 to 3 years. So that's not great. The life cycle of an emerald ash borer is that a female will come along and lay eggs, about 40 to 70 eggs from one individual female on the bark of an ash. And then those eggs will hatch and the larvae will sort of burrow their way or bore their way into the tissue, the inner tissues of the tree. And they'll live there and they'll just eat and tunnel and grow for a year or 2 years, kind of depending on the conditions. And then eventually these larvae will pupate into adults. And then the adults will emerge and we'll see this really characteristic sort of D-shaped exit hole where the adult has emerged. And again, that could be anywhere from 1 to 2 years after it was originally sort of infected with emerald ash borer. And the real key thing here is that from an outsider's point of view, we don't know if that ash tree has emerald ash borer yet, but it has, by the time we see these D-shaped holes, it's been infected for 1 to 2 years and probably going to die then in 2 to 3 years after that happens. So we're always, there's this negative sort of time feedback loop with emerald ash borer and us knowing if an ash tree is infected or not. But essentially we can assume if there's ash borer in the area, the ash tree is likely infected. These adults emerge then and they can disperse anywhere from 1 to 3 kilometers, generally speaking, but experimental lab tests have shown they can go up to 20 to 30 kilometers, so really big dispersal distance looking for their next sort of ash stand to infect, and then the cycle goes again and again. So I think it's pretty fair to say that it's a pretty bleak future for ash. Since 2002, and I guess this picture is showing, you can see all those like sort of worm patterns, that's the damage from the larvae. But since 2002, a relatively short amount of time, emerald ash borer has spread throughout all of the eastern United States and also into Canada, which isn't pictured on this map, and has wiped out the majority of ash trees as it sort of goes through its infestation path. Again, emerald ash borer, because our native ash trees don't have any natural defenses, it'll kill basically all the ash trees that it comes in contact with. The way that we've been kind of dealing with this is to have quarantine. So you can't move trees if there's emerald ash borer known to be in an area. So you can't move like firewood, for example. And I'm sure you've seen signs if you're out and about in the world at all. Based on the spread that has happened and everybody kind of used quarantine zones, it hasn't been super effective, but maybe has slowed the rate at which emerald ash borer would have spread. But basically, if we're moving firewood, we're letting emerald ash borer maybe hitchhike because again, we can't really see until we see those D-shaped holes if it's infected with the larvae or not. But the repercussions of this are huge. It's cost hundreds of millions of dollars in the United States and Canada, and those costs are at municipality levels, private property owners, obviously the forest products industry, a pretty big deal. And if we look at this picture on the bottom here from Toledo, there's a 3-year difference between these two pictures before and after emerald ash borer. You see on this beautiful residential street, complete mortality of ash trees that are oftentimes planted, along the sort of berm or boulevard area. So now we have dead trees just standing in your neighborhood that could obviously cause a lot of property damage. We've lost the habitat for a lot of urban species. There's reduced shade, obviously a change in aesthetic, but it could increase cooling costs, for example. A lot of repercussions that come with this, increased cost to the city. They have to go and remove the dead trees. It's a really big deal, and a lot of different cities, of course, have been dealing with it for quite a while now. So here in Minnesota, we first detected emerald ash borer in the southern part of the state. It's definitely established in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all of sort of the surrounding neighborhoods where there's a lot of ash trees planted as part of that neighborhood aesthetic. Minneapolis had tried to be really proactive about it, knew emerald ash borer was going, learned from other neighboring states, and started trying to kind of preemptively remove 5,000 ash trees per year so they didn't have to deal with like dead trees and sort of the damage those might cause. And so that was a pretty good strategy. They're trying to replant with different kind of species, different tree species as well. But if we think about it, that's 60,000 mature trees that are lost from this urban forest environment. That has really big consequences. From the cities area, really, we've seen a lot of ash that's dispersed in some of the river system, so Minnesota, Mississippi River, where there's little pockets of ash around too. But obviously it's been spreading and will likely continue to spread anywhere there is ash. A few years ago, we had first discovered emerald ash borer in Duluth, and I don't think it was a surprise to anybody, but it is concerning because Duluth is basically the front door, the front porch to our northern forest system. And so we've been really keeping a close eye on that and sort of watching the spread that is more than likely to occur through the northern part of the state as well. There's been a lot of efforts looking at planning and trying to figure out mitigation plans so we can address, we're losing species of ash in North America, extirpated. We've seen this before with things like elm trees, right? If you guys remember, maybe 30 years ago, there was Dutch elm disease and it kind of did something similar, but there wasn't as much as sort of the natural existence, I guess, as there is of black ash here in Minnesota, at least. But we want to think about, well, what can we do to maintain this ecological function? But while a lot of the efforts have been focused in on the urban areas, and rightfully so, we think that the non-urban areas will have the highest potential for overall impact on broader ecological functions, which is what we'll talk about the rest of the day. But just a little overview. So we have nearly 1 billion ash trees in Minnesota, and there's basically 3 species. Green ash is what we find in a lot of the neighborhoods, the cities, including Duluth. Then we also have sort of natural occurring green ash in a lot of the floodplain forests, especially in the southern part of the state. White ash we find as a sort of smaller component in a lot of upland hardwood forests. And then black ash, though, is the guy, he's the star of the show. And we have a ton of black ash and more in the state, and more black ash than they have in any of the other states or provinces that we've that has already been infested with emerald ash borer. So in Minnesota, we have 1 million acres of black ash forest. 1 million acres. That's a huge amount of black ash forests in the state. And you can see on the map that it's dispersed throughout the entire sort of forested sections of Minnesota. Widely distributed, and we see it in a lot of different conditions. We see it in little pockets, maybe like subcomponents of different forests, but we have vast stands, vast landscapes of just black ash forests in the northern part of the state. And that's going to be a really big deal when emerald ash borer reaches those stands and those trees are potentially lost from our forest systems. What's really important about black ash is that it's a foundational species. And that means that it regulates a lot of different ecosystem processes that I'll elaborate on the next slide. But a foundational species, which basically means it can't be easily replaced. We can't just throw an aspen in and hope everything is going to be the same. We have to think about how it functions in this unique system. And then also very importantly, it's a cultural keystone species. It's made by a lot of different tribes in Minnesota and throughout North America for basket making because it's a pliable wood, and so it can bend and be weaved more easily than a lot of other woods. And then it's also part of quite a few tribes' creation stories, and so it's important for long-term cultural species as well. But we put these things together, and there's obviously really great potential impacts for changes in hydrology, water quality, tree regeneration, and then of course wildlife. So I've had the privilege to work with a lot of wonderful researchers in Minnesota, and we focused on sort of trying to understand the natural conditions of black ash wetlands throughout the northern part of the state. And also been using different kinds of experiments to sort of understand, well, what's going to happen to these systems when EAB comes in. And those researchers are Tony D'Amato, Rob Slezak, Brian Pollack, Melissa Youngquist, and a few folks that work in my lab, Steve Colby and Josh Bedner as well, have been really critical in doing a lot of this research. It's been ongoing for a long time. We've been doing the bird work for at least 5 years, but there are just a wonderful group of researchers also in Minnesota and throughout the Great Lakes states that we sort of work with collaboratively to try and understand and mitigate impacts of emerald ash borer. But our studies are specific to like sort of this part of Minnesota. And what those studies have shown is that black ash, the loss of black ash will impact the habitat in the following ways. We remove black ash, we don't have that increased evapotranspiration, and basically we have more ponding, or the water levels rise in these stands, right? And so we get more pooling. And now in a natural condition where we have a lot of black ash, like you can see in my picture in the background, that ponding would just be like pretty temporary and the trees would sort of soak it up. But as the trees aren't there anymore, the ponding becomes more permanent, and that leads to a change in the understory plant communities, and we can transition from forested wetlands to more emergent wetlands. Another thing that's really important is that black ash is the dominant tree species in a lot of these forested wetlands. And so, if that's the only thing that's in the seed bank or regenerating, obviously there's going to lead to a lack of forested conditions if we don't do anything. And so if we just let it all be, emerald ash borer comes in, kills all the black ash, we're going to lose these forested conditions in these forested wetlands. And that has a big obvious consequence for wildlife as well. So just a really short summary of our research that we've done focused on birds. We sort of wanted to ask the question, well, how will black ash, the loss of black ash impact birds? And the first question we wanted to ask, well, there's a lot of forests in Minnesota. Are the bird communities in these black ash forests actually unique at all? And the answer is yes, they actually are very unique. And it's that combination of the trees, plus that water component, plus a lot of structure that you don't see in a lot of other forest types in, especially in managed areas. So there's lots of cavities, there's a lot of snags, there's they're higher density, like a subcanopy. And so there's just these unique features that you can't find in, let's say, a managed aspen stand, for example. And the birds respond favorably to that. And also I think the water component increases the insect abundance, but I don't have the data to support that. But delicious food, it's a buffet, everybody wants to hang out there. There are a few species that are indicators, which means that they're found in higher abundance or frequency in these black ash stands than in other areas. And 3 of those indicator species, brown creeper, great crested flycatcher, and winter wren, are species of greatest conservation need in the state. And so, thinking about these forests as having high conservation value and sort of using that as fuel to say, well, we got to do something in terms of management to conserve these species and these communities in the long term, I think is a valuable way to think about it. And then we also use these experimental treatments to sort of simulate EAB infestation, and then the black ash died and sort of started transitioning to more of an emergent wetland situation. And we asked the question, well, will EAB change these bird communities? And not surprisingly, the bird communities become very different when you take the trees out of the story. And so that has big consequences too, because we know we'll see changes when emerald ash borer comes in and causes that widespread mortality in these black ash systems, which is likely already ongoing. But like I said, we've been focusing a lot on the wetland systems sort of that are in part of that forest matrix. And so I was really interested to work with Cole and the folks at the NER to sort of put together Cole's study to figure out, do we see similar patterns, or do we see a similar situation ongoing with the black ash that's very dominant in the St. Louis River Estuary. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the virtual baton to Cole, and he can talk about his awesome work.
Thanks, Alexis. So as Alexis was speaking about earlier, we've been given this great broad overview of black ash and how important it is and how it serves as a foundational species. And now it's kind of time to zoom in and look at what that looks like in the St. Louis River Estuary. And so the focus of my research was on, with Alexis and the reserve, was really to look at breeding bird populations in the St. Louis River Estuary during the month of June in black ash forests, and figure out what structural elements are really strongly related to avian richness. So that's the number of species. So if something's more rich, there's a greater number of species. And then also to look at abundance, and then to take this information and think, how can we use this knowledge for future management? What we know, as Alexis mentioned, that black ash is inevitably going to die off. And what can we take from these studies to apply to future management and restoration efforts when we want to look for certain structural elements which we find are particularly important to these breeding bird communities. And so before I start, I do want to acknowledge that where this research took place, the Gitchigami Zibi, also known as the St. Louis River, is the traditional and current homeland of the Anishinaabe Ojibwe people and other indigenous peoples before them. And the Lake Superior Reserve and the NRRI celebrate and honor ancestral Anishinaabe land and sacred lands of all indigenous peoples through their work and their partnerships. So I'm sure this is probably a crowd that is pretty familiar with where the St. Louis River is, but just in case, it's tucked in that southwest pocket of Lake Superior right there between Duluth and Superior. And then zooming in further, we can see the outline of the reserve here in yellow. And that's where most of my study sites were and the area that we wanted to focus on for this particular look at breeding bird species. And then these are the 12 study sites. You can see those yellow pins that stretch along the St. Louis River. This is about a 3 to 4 mile stretch of the river between the Oliver Bridge would be just to the right of the map. And then Jake Hook is on the far left side of the map in that upper left-hand corner. You can see the dam there. And these 12 study sites really tried to account for variation in black ash. So not only did we look at island black ash, but we also looked at black ash that was right on the shore of the river, that was really close to the river. And then we also looked at sites that were further inland to kind of look at, okay, these are all black ash wetlands, but they're very different in terms of their proximity to the river and other aspects, which I'll get into in just a moment. And so when we look at these bird communities and the forest, how do we actually turn what our intuitions are and into actual metrics that we can measure and compare to each other? So for our bird communities, we used 10-minute point counts, and there's an example survey sheet there on that top photo. And what you do for that is you sit in one spot for 10 minutes at a time, and anything that you hear and or see is written down. And those circles are 10, 20, 50, and 100-meter radius circles. And so that can kind of help you to keep track of where the birds are in relation to you and how far away they are in case you're on the edge of a habitat. And you can also denote whether they're singing or they flew by, because anything that you hear and see is what gets recorded in the point count survey. And since I was doing my surveys on breeding birds, I did them twice during the month of June, and they had to be 14 days apart at each site. So let's say I visit one site on June 1st, I would come back again on June 15th to make sure that we're really characterizing the breeding birds that are there during the entirety of the month of June and not just at one point in time. And as for our forests, we looked at a number of metrics to kind of figure out what structural aspects of these black ash forests might be important and might tell us something about what bird species prefer certain aspects or don't prefer certain aspects of these black ash forests. So we looked at canopy height, we looked at black ash dominance. That's the percentage of trees in a stand that are black ash. So everything we looked at was greater than 50% black ash, but there might have been 50%, 80%, 90% black ash in a given stand. We looked at stem counts. So that's what's going to make up your understory. So those are going to be shrubs, anything that's woody and has to be greater than a half meter or roughly knee height. And then we also looked at ground cover. So that could include, in my study site, what is covered with leaves, what's leaf litter, what's mud, what is grass, what is sedge, what is dead wood on the ground, to kind of give us an idea of what the very bottom layer of that structure looks like. And then canopy cover, that's also expressed as a percent. So what percentage of the sky above you is being covered by the forest leaves and canopy. We also did tree counts by size. So we would classify these trees into small, medium, and large size classes. And that could help us figure out, okay, this might be a more mature forest, might be a younger forest. And then finally, we measured snags as well, which are dead trees, which are important not only for birds as a habitat and possible nesting site, but also for their food source during the breeding season, which is largely insects. And so that dead wood, those dead trees really provide a lot of great habitat for insects and their prey, birds and their prey insects. Moving forward, we can see what some of these looked like. So I talked a little bit earlier about black ash dominance and expressed as a percent. So you can see that even though all of our sites were black ash dominated, there really was quite a bit of variance in terms of just how dominant black ash was in these stands. And so we look at some sites where roughly 60% black ash dominant, all the way to even more than 90. And so while you see this in a graph, it's great to see it in pictures and see, what does this really look like? The photo on the left here was a site that had 60% black ash dominance, and the photo on the right was more than 90% black ash dominance. And you can see that even though these are black ash forests, they look really, really different in terms of not just on having more or less black ash trees, but also what's growing up beneath them. So on the left, you can see with less black ash, there's a lot of shrubs. There's, a completely different understory ground cover. It's really sedgy. There's some flowers growing up. And then on the right side, it's not as sedgy. The canopy is a lot more open. There's not as much understory. There's not really many shrubs. And the forest floor there is dominated by ferns. Another forest metric that we took a look at was woody stem density per 10 square meters. So that goes back to the stem counts, like I mentioned earlier. So it's got to be greater than a half meter in height, woody stems. And again, there was really a lot of variance across these black ash forests where some had no woody stems at all really in the understory, and then others had more than, almost 25 woody stems per 10 square meters. So really thick understory. And then graphs are great again, but when we look at it in pictures, this really gives us a better idea of just how different these black ash forests can be. The photo on the right there, dominated by black ash, really no woody stems at all. It's a fern dominated understory. And then on the left here, you can see a lot of shrubs. It's really thick. You can't even pick out the black ash really because the understory is so thick there that it provides a completely different type of habitat than we see in the photo on the right. And then in terms of our avian results, you can see here number of species observed there along the x-axis, and then the site number there on the left. And these are the total number of species observed at one site, which is also really interesting to see. You could think that 24 different bird species you could hear and or see in just 10 minutes is pretty remarkable and speaks to the richness and abundance of birds in these black ash forests. Then here are some nice pictures as well of these bird species. So this is the third time actually you've seen this photo of an ovenbird there on the left. And then on the right, that's a little American redstart nest that I stumbled upon, which was actually at waist level. It was great. I didn't have to climb any trees or anything. And once the female flew off the nest, I just moved in quickly for a photo and was on my way before she came back. But it was really neat to see them, so close up. And obviously, most of the time when you're doing these surveys, you hear birds more often than you see them. And then when we look at the most common species observed, we see common yellowthroat, yellow warbler as our two most commonly observed species. And then there were also more common birds that, you might see in your backyard. They're not at all unique to black ash forests. Red-winged blackbird, American robin, grackles are all really common birds in a multitude of environments. But we also saw some species which are actually in the state of Minnesota species of concern, and those are the veery and the leafed flycatcher. So it was really quite interesting to see those as some of the more abundant species in these black ash forests. And then here's some great pictures. These were actually taken by Hannah Ramage, who's here. That's a yellow warbler on the left, and then an inquisitive little black and white warbler there on the right. So when we put these results together, what did we actually see? On the y-axis there, you have black ash dominance. That's as a percent. So again, that's the percentage of trees in a stand or in an area in the study site that are black ash. And then total number of bird species observed is down there along the x-axis. And as you can see, that percentage of black ash really is quite interestingly correlated with an increase in the total number of species observed at a given site, or species richness, which just kind of underscores that point that black ash are these really important species ecologically, and they provide habitat for a wide range of birds, in addition to providing habitat for some of those species of concern that I spoke about earlier. And then we can also look at this through the lens of an NMDS analysis, which is non-metric multidimensional scaling. And this allows us to take multiple variables and look at them together. And when you look at this chart, each of those black dots represents one study site. And the closer two study sites are together on this chart, the more similar their bird species communities were together. So, and then those arrows with the bird species on them, you can see a yellow warbler, red-eyed vireo, red-winged blackbird, least flycatcher, and on those are influential species which were dragging those dots to a certain quadrant of this plot. So you can see the least flycatcher was moving those dots in the upper left quadrant up and towards the left, and you wouldn't be as likely to see a least flycatcher in the bird communities on the right side of the graph, which you were more strongly correlated with red-winged blackbird abundance. And then we can also take this data and overlay interesting forest structural features with it. So here we looked at canopy height in relation to those bird communities. And keep in mind that this is the same plot. So all these bird communities are in the same space that they were earlier. We've just added this sort of filter to how we view these. So we can see here that a species like the least flycatcher, which relies on open understory because it's what's called an aerial insectivore. They eat a lot of insects and they catch them in the air. They need that open space to fly around, that they would need that higher canopy height, and which is indicated here by a darker dot on the plot. And so it makes a lot of sense that those study sites which are close to that least flycatcher arrow being pulled up into the left quadrant of the plot have a higher canopy height, which would be more suitable for those species like least flycatcher. And then bringing it back here to the management implications of this, we see that there are large variations in structure between areas of black ash forested wetlands. So this was just a 3 to 4 mile corridor of the estuary, and there were these huge variances in the number of species seen, the percentage of black ash. And so not all of these black ash dominant forests are the same or provide the same ecological value to a given species. And when we think about this going forward, we have to think about the threat of invasive species because the black ash die-off is almost inevitable. We know that species like buckthorn, which you can see in the background of the slide here, are primed to move into these areas. And this photo is actually one that I took in an area where there was a good amount of black ash die-off, and buckthorn really thrives in those areas that black ash dies off in. There's nothing to shade it out. And so they move in and they don't provide the same sort of structural features which black ash do, as Alexis mentioned earlier. And then it's also important that we think about climatically resilient replacement tree species. And what I mean by this is that we need to look at what structural features are important for these bird species and other wildlife, and then think about what species can we replace black ash with now that will also be resilient in the face of future climate change. So that could include stuff like changing water levels, changing temperatures, changing precipitation. All of these things need to be really carefully taken into consideration when choosing replacement species. And then also, we've just spent a lot of time talking about how they're ecologically important, but also, as Alexis mentioned earlier, these are extremely important species to Indigenous culture. And so it's important that we incorporate Indigenous knowledge into choosing replacement species, because especially for Ojibwe people of this area, it's important for basket weaving, as Alexis mentioned, and then also lacrosse sticks or fish wares, all things which are culturally important aspects of Indigenous culture here. So it's important that we really need to make sure that those replacement species are suitable for those types of activities as well, and cultural touch points. And then also managing for specific types of black ash wetlands. These are not all created equally, as I said earlier, and so managing for black ash wetlands, which are conducive to species like least flycatcher, might be more important right now than managing for species which are suitable to, American redstart or red-winged blackbird, which are not of conservation concern. And then finally, just some take-home messages here, that black ash forests, and they support unique wildlife communities and provide connectivity across the landscape, that are these, supporting these unique wildlife communities, and then also providing connectivity, are all really important for functional ecosystems, which can support a wide range of wildlife. And then also determining the optimal replacement species for black ash is something that we can use our current research to help us inform those choices going forward. And then also targeting our adaptive management on priority wetlands. So these black ash wetlands, which are particularly important to a given species of bird or mammal or amphibian or insect, we want to target those wetlands with the replacement species and use that information that we've gained from these studies to make sure that we're addressing those wetlands which are of highest conservation concern and priority. Now I'll hand it back to Alexis to talk about some of the work going on in the estuary.
Awesome. Thank you, Cole. That was awesome. Yeah, just to really wrap it up and sort of focus on how wonderful the group of partners that work in the St. Louis River Estuary are. We're already having a lot of action around this idea of we have to do something or all the black ash will just, and the important forested wetland ecosystems will go away. And so we have sort of efforts on both the Minnesota and the Wisconsin side. And so Minnesota Land Trust and Community Action Duluth have funding, and they will be completing understory plantings in black ash forests in 3 different sites: Chambers Grove, North Bay, and Rask Bay, on overall about 30 acres. And that will happen over the next few years. Those 3 sites were identified by some of the work NRI did for Minnesota Land Trust as really important for bird diversity, but also a species that migrates through Minnesota, a rusty blackbird that is a threatened species. And so it's really exciting to see how actionable our research was, and how Minnesota Land Trust and Community Action Duluth really sort of partnered on getting work done. And similarly, on the other side of the river, the Lake Superior Reserve and the Wisconsin DNR are planning to do invasive species control specifically for buckthorn, and then sort of do that this year, and then do the understory plantings the following year on 5 different sites: Clough Island, Red River Breaks, Walleye Alley, Duck Hunter Bay, and Landslide Bay. And they plan to plant around 80,000 trees on 100 acres, which is so amazing and so exciting. And basically the idea is that they're planting a suite of species. We know there's not one size fits all what's going to replace black ash in the ecosystem. And we don't know enough. It's sort of a big experiment to see what tree species are going to take, what's going to grow, and how that's going to function in the ecosystem. So I think there'll be a lot of long-term monitoring of both the fates of the trees and the different tree species, and how the bird and wildlife communities are sort of responding to that. Sort of the strategy these groups have taken to identify replacement tree species, and also the strategies we take for the replacement trees that we're doing, throughout the rest of Minnesota, is, like Cole mentioned, is planting a suite of trees that are maybe naturally found in these areas, but also climate adapted, can tolerate the flood and droughts that we know we're having and will continue to have. Incorporating those culturally important aspects when it makes sense, and importantly, just not sitting back and letting the trees die and just watching it all happen. And I think that's huge. But some of the species are things like basswood, white cedar, American elm, Dutch elm resistant American elm, swamp white oak, balsam poplar. And so it'll be really exciting, as this research continues, as the replacement tree efforts continue, to see how it'll change the river, but hopefully make it more resilient and help conserve that biodiversity. Cole, did you want to do your acknowledgements?
Hop in here. Hannah Ramage, who was my research mentor at the reserve, just was fantastic in every way and offering support, and could not have been better for even coming out with me at 4 a.m. to do bird surveys. So she really did it all. Dr. Anna Pigeon, who's a professor at UW-Madison, was great, helping me reason through some of the ecological data and figuring out why I might be seeing certain trends. Dustin Haynes, who's at the University of Minnesota Duluth as well, was really great and helped me, especially on the plant side of things, to figure out, identifying species, and then also figuring out the techniques that I would be using to measure those forest structural metrics. And Dr. Alexis Grinde, who's here speaking, really just could not have been nicer in terms of lending me any support I need in terms of providing research methods, helping me to get out on a couple of birding days with her team, and just could not have been better. And then also some of the photos in this presentation were also by Hannah Ramage and Dustin Haynes, who I mentioned earlier.
And then just quickly, I just wanted to mention my collaborators for the other research that I mentioned, Melissa Youngquist, Rob Slezak, Brian Pollock, and Tony D'Amato. They are awesome, and we have a lot of fun doing this research together. And we'd love to take questions.
Thank you so much, you guys. That was great. We did have a couple questions come in the chat that I can jump right into. So we have the first one is, do you have citizen science opportunities? So it sounds like people might want to come out there with you or do things with you for this research.
As a matter of fact, I'm just going to go to this next slide that I didn't add in here and tell you that we have an initiative that I fondly call Getting Birdie in the St. Louis River Estuary with Great Lakes Audubon. And basically, you know, you can sign up to adopt a block or these different areas in the St. Louis River Estuary and go and bird. And we have a sort of a portal in Ebird where you can stick all your observations. Even if you do it once, it's super valuable to us. But sort of in terms of research, you know, we're out there 2 times. These systems are super dynamic. So anytime anybody can be out there in the spring, during the breeding season, in the fall, that's awesome. And so if you want more information, you can email me, and I'm sure my email address is somewhere available, agrinde@d.umn.edu.
Yeah, if you want to put that in the chat so people can just like email you immediately, that'd be great.
And also, I should say that that name is not sanctioned by Great Lakes Audubon and is definitely an Alexis Grinde thing alone.
I like it. Sounds like other people do too. And I would just say, as far as the Lake Superior Reserve side of things, we do not have any like current citizen science programs going right now, but we are working on some stewardship of black ash forests, like was discussed about plantings. And if you want to volunteer in any way for tree planting and things related to that project, we can hook you up too. So if you're in the non-bird side of things, but the tree side of things, that's more your jam, you can send an email to, I don't know, I think Deanna's on the call. Maybe she can put her email in there or Kirsten's email so you can get in touch with us too. So the second question that came in through the chat was, when looking for replacement species, have you looked at the diversity of caterpillars that the black ash supports?
That's a good question. I don't think so. Maybe in some of the eastern parts where they've done more research on the replacement species, or it's sort of been going on a little bit longer. But you want to know, nothing's ringing a bell. I should definitely look into it. That's actually a really great point.
Yeah, so Deanna just added into the chat there that there's you can get onto the Lake Superior Reserve Facebook page, or a URL for our friends group that are organizing buckthorn removal in September. So you can always bird while you're removing buckthorn too. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. So if anyone else has any other questions, you can either drop them in the chat, or, you know, don't be shy, raise your hand, or just come off video and ask any question you want to. While you think of your question, I had one. Even though I worked with Cole, I still have more and more questions every time I see you present, because I learn something each time. What I would like each of you to do maybe is, you know, we saw lots of ways that you can describe black ash forests with data, right? Like you can measure the size of the trees, you can measure the understory, you can quantify this, you can do a percentage of like that. But could you describe to us what it's like to be in a black ash wetland forest as opposed to like another habitat? What is it like? Can you just describe it without numbers?
Alexis, did you want to go first or did you want
You
me
go
to?
ahead, Cole.
Okay, that's a really good question. I would have to, I don't know, it is pretty amazing to be in these areas. One of those photos that I included there with just after the stem count one, where you have these black ash dominated forests where the canopy is really, really high and the understory is just completely open. So it's all ferns, there's no shrubs, it's just ferns and it's completely open. It feels like you're inside of a dome almost. And I had never seen that really in another forested habitat. And so that was something that I just thought was pretty remarkable and stood out to me right away. Was I almost felt like I was surrounded or inside of a forest, even though I was still outside.
Yeah, that's great. And I would say something very similar. First, very buggy. And then two, in a lot of the black ash wetlands that we work at, it's sort of like aspen, and then there's sort of like a gradual slope. And it feels like, in Jurassic Park, the opening titles where they open the gate and you're going into this sort of magical land. That's literally what it feels like in when you're going into black. It's so different from surrounding forests. And so it feels like you're in some sort of magical secret place, like you went through some magic portal and now you're there. And then the humidity changes because of the water as well. And then there is like sort of, I think that dome-like feeling about it is really true for a lot of black ash areas, but you can feel the uniqueness. A lot of these stands are so much older than any of the other forest stands that you sort of interact with, especially as we're sort of through the northern part of the state and a lot of managed forests. And you can feel that structural diversity. It's hard to walk through and scary sometimes because you don't know how wet it is, but it is very unique. And I think one of the things that sort of concerns me with losing the black ash is just that loss of uniqueness, that loss of experience, and the fact that a lot of people have almost go around black ash, like it's buggy and it's wet, and we've never really sat in that special bubble that it provides across our landscape. Great question, Hannah.
Yeah, it's awesome question, Hannah.
Deanna has come on camera, which I think means she has a question. Go for it.
Well, it's actually something of a research prompt, something I'm curious about. So first, I wanted to just like throw in a black ash fact. So the name for black ash in Ojibwe is Agimak, and that comes from Agim, or which is snowshoes. So they're also used for snowshoes. So there's like all kinds of things that black ash do just the way they are. But the thing I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of records actually of elm in the upper estuary. And one of the things I'm curious about, I don't know if Alexis, if you've ever read about it at all, is, what was lost when we lost elm in terms of bird habitat? I'm just curious if there's any like historical surveys or knowledge that you've ever come across related to that.
I haven't found anything that's really specific to elm and like bird communities, that aligns with what we're doing here. But it's such a good question. And I think that is sort of the analog to what we've experienced before and what we're going to be experiencing. We're just losing this tree species. I think the difference is, you didn't have like elm stands the way that you have black ash stands, and so maybe it wasn't as much on everybody's radar back then. I'm not entirely sure, but in some of our underplantings, and I think in the estuary as well, we'll be using those Dutch elm resistant strains of elm trees and trying to reintroduce that back in. And I think that's going to provide a lot of similar habitat characteristics that black ash has done. So I think that's hopefully those resistant strains stay resistant and will really establish and sort of grow up. And for those of us that are old enough to remember how cool old elm trees looked, like they're awesome. And so I think they'll be really amazing for birds, decades from now.
Luciana.
Hey, Cole, I don't remember last summer if you were learning to identify birds as part of this project or if you already knew them.
I had already, or I did, obviously I did not know all of them. I will never know every bird in the area, but I had done quite a bit of birding in high school. And I also had taken an ornithology class the spring prior, where we learned to identify quite a few species by both their call and by sight, so their physical attributes.
So I guess the question for you and Alexis is when you like see a bird and you like put up your binoculars and then you have your eyeballs on it, like, is there a certain part of the bird you look at first to like try to figure out what it is? Or are they just like seared into your memory so you see it and then you automatically know? Asking for tips and to know how you do this.
Did you want to go first with that one, Alexis? And then I can, oh, okay. I think the head is a really great place to start. A lot of birds will have pretty distinctive markings around their eyes or their throat. So I would say like the throat, the head, and then also some birds look really similar, but they have certain bars on their wings that might help you to tell them apart. And in your bird guide, if it has a habitat section, sometimes that can also help you to figure out, well, I'm in this habitat, there's no way, it most likely is not this species. Can help you limit the options.
Yeah, I think those are key. Right now is a great time to start learning birds because you can really master, okay, we got the chickadees, we got some juncos, there's a pretty low diversity right now. And, the birds generally come back in little waves. And so if you go out, even just in your yard and are like really get a few of the common ones down, that really helps anchor your mind and be like, okay, well, this is a small bird, this is a medium-sized bird. And then you can sort of say, when you look at it, like Cole said, and you look at the head, you can say, okay, well, that looks like a sparrow because it's got like sort of a short, blunt kind of beak, or this is a warbler because it's like got a yellowish tint or something like that. And you can start like kind of binning them almost. And if you can start doing that, then you can like sort of look for those like wing bars or like an eye ring or something like that and be like, okay, I know that's a Nashville warbler and because X, Y, and Z, and then you can just kind of build up confidence. But I will say that I always get a little bit nervous when the big flights come in and it's been a year and I haven't ID'd a bird. I'm like, oh crap, what is it? Even though it's my job, it's still very overwhelming. There's so many birds here. I don't feel like anybody can be like a super expert because it's tricky and a lot of the same species look different sometimes too. So give yourself grace and just enjoy the process. And if you're wrong, who cares, Yeah.
We have another question that came in through the chat, which is the 1,000,000 acres of black ash in Minnesota are primarily an expansive inland wetland. So how will the results from the estuary translate to the rest of the state? So I'm wondering, Alexis, if you wanted to talk more about your research in the other Minnesota forests and how it might relate to what Cole was finding here in the estuary.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that's one of the things that I was really curious about is if we see that similar pattern. And, before Cole did a study, I thought, well, in the estuary, there's a lot of black ash, but it's not like as expansive as it is in those inland wetlands. And so maybe we won't see that big like species richness. And I thought maybe even the black ash stands in the estuary would be less diverse than what we see in the rest of the state. And I was wrong, and so I think it's just more powerful to say, even though they're very different, coal got more of the emergent wetland species because there's probably more water next to that river system, like a lot more red-winged blackbirds than we get in the forested systems, which isn't surprising at all. But that we did see that same sort of richness and abundance response, and that this black ash dominance is almost exclusively the same pattern as we see in the inland. I think it just sort of goes to solidify the fact that, man, we got to do some work. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be hard. It's going to be long, but we've got to do something and not just let these trees die off. And then what will be really interesting too is to see, we have these replacement studies that are going on in the rest of the state, and sort of seeing how the outcomes of the tree survival align with what's happening in those the inland wetlands compared to the river system. I think will be really important, because again, there's not a one size fits all. The key thing about all black ash wetlands is they're all very diverse in a lot of different ways. And so figuring out like, well, here's a handful of trees, if we plant them all, at least one of them will survive and maybe grow to maturity and that kind of thing. And so there are some definite parallels, and I think looking at both the riverine system now and the inland system just provides a lot more sort of holistic look at what these systems provide currently, and basically a benchmark to sort of measure success of restoration against.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, I thought it was really interesting from a non-bird background experience, because it was really great in early conversations with the both of you when we were trying to figure out Cole's project about like, are black ash systems in the estuary relatable, right? Like we're on this big river, this big estuary, it's not surrounded by the same habitats as being nestled into a different forest type. And so it was really great to see the sort of evolution of the project and some of the sort of similar excitement about richness. I know Cole was just 24 birds in one site. I mean, I don't know what that means that much as someone who doesn't come from a bird background, but I sat out there one morning with Cole and just was so impressed with the ability to even ID by sound and the cacophony that was happening in that one site that we were in that morning. So it was just really exciting to see that project unfold. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, for a little context, in a lot of our forest monitoring sites, 14 different species is really common in a lot of aspen stands, and then like in red pine plantations, for example, it's like 9 species. And so it's a significantly more species are using these systems. And yeah, so I use that term high conservation value. And I think that's definitely appropriate.
Well, we have one more question in the chat, and then I think we may wrap up from there. So, oh, now we have 2. Well, okay, maybe we'll just fit them in real quick. So the first is, does the USDA hardiness zone have any effect on emerald ash borer?
So I think there was a lot of hope that Minnesota would be too cold for emerald ash borer to really like rage hard like they did in some of the southern states. That's a scientific term. And I think, in their very cold winters, maybe it'll knock it back and kill off some of the larvae, but it's certainly not a solution. And we've had many more warm winters that, based on, I think, a lot of the experimental stuff that has been done with emerald ash borer, that it has to be very cold for a very long time. And we're not seeing that very consistently anymore. So the answer is maybe back in the day when Minnesota was had more extreme winters, it could have been more of a factor, and it will be, and maybe will slow the spread, but not to the extent that I think we're hoping.
Yeah, I think that's something to get you through the cold spells in February, is just be like, this is good for knocking back emerald ash borer. That's what I was thinking in February this year. I was like, it's good, it's fine. Okay, so one last one here will fit in. How can someone set up their own replacement tree site?
Yeah, that's a great question. there are a lot of different places that you can get trees. I know I live a little bit up the shore, and there are different nonprofits that are sort of set up to like give trees, like for example, white spruce is one that like they to sort of increase the conifer component. But if you can identify some trees, and certainly the list that I provided isn't extensive or exhaustive, there's a lot of different trees that might fit into this natural plant community. But if you can find them or get buy them or whatever you want to do it, the way that we do it is sort of set up a grid system with flagging and then just plant them where it makes sense, you know, likely up high where there's not a lot of flooding if you're in that kind of an area on the land. And then you just plant them, and you probably want to do veg control around them the second year. And then the big thing I think for figuring out what's the best replacement species is the long-term monitoring of the tree, what's surviving, what got eaten by deer, you know, and sometimes depending on the tree, you might want to like cover them so the deer don't come chomping in on them in the winter or whatever. But and sort of thinking about that systematically, or just planting trees is a good thing to do. In Minnesota, we've got a lot of mortality from lots of things like spruce budworm and eastern larch beetle. And so any trees that you're sort of including into the environment is probably a good point in most systems, I think, broadly speaking. So yeah, I think I can probably find some resources on where to get potential replacement tree species. If you want to email me about it, that would be great.
Okay, great. Thanks for all your questions, everybody, and making that interactive. And thank you to both of you, Cole and Alexis, for sharing your work. And I just do want to remind everybody before we close that there is one more River Talks in this series. So the next one is May 11th. And it is going to be an epic celebration of Wisconsin Sea Grant's 50th anniversary. So Jim Hurley is going to be in person at the estuarium at 3 Marina Drive in Superior, but we will also have an option to join virtually. However, only those that come in person will get to eat cake. So if you're virtual, you'll have to make your own cake and eat it with us over Zoom. So make sure to mark your calendars for May 11th. To find out about River Talks, like in the long term, you can get on our email list, and that way we'll always remind you of what's going on and the topics and where you can join. So Marie is on, and maybe she wants to put her email in the chat one more time so that you can just directly email her to get on the list. Otherwise, you can always find our events on the Reserve Facebook page or the Wisconsin Sea Grant Facebook page too. So you can find us there. But with that, just thank you so much for joining and listening in. And thanks to our speakers one last time.
Thanks, everybody. Awesome job, Cole.
Listening, everyone. Thank you, Alexis. You too.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks, Ryan.
No sweat. Great job, Cole.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Hannah. Good to virtually
great
see
job.
you. We'll see you in person soon enough. So